The following feature presentation is part of the Skywalking Network.
Welcome to Star Warsologies, the podcast about science and other academic fields of study as seen in Star Wars. I'm one of your hosts, James Floyd. I am a freelance writer for StarWars.com and Star Wars Insider Magazine.
And I'm Melissa Miller. I also freelance for Star Wars Insider Magazine, and I'm the science and technology writer for Nerdist. This episode, Star Warsologies, is going to chat about medicine, as represented in Star Wars by the bacta tanks, life support systems, Jedi healing, and all sorts of other things. Our guest experts today are Dr. Jackson Vane and Johnny Kolasinksi. They are the hosts of one of my favorite podcasts, Hi Everbody, a Bad Medicine podcast. Dr. Vane is a pediatric emergency doctor, and Johnny is a writer for the Roddenberry podcast Sci-Fi 5. Welcome, Johnny and Jackson.
Hi.
Hi, folks. Welcome to our show. Dr. Vane is a pediatric emergency medicine doctor. Can you go into a little more depth on that?
Yeah, it's a subspecialty of pediatrics or emergency medicine. Deal with basically anything that shows up at any time in the emergency department. So it could be something as benign as a fever for an hour, or getting scared because we saw lightning, which was actually one of my patients recently, where they heard lightning, called 911, brought them in. Or it could be something as dramatic as losing a limb, or even like full cardiac arrest. So the gamut is very wide. So we always joke around when we say we are both the dumbest and smartest doctors in the hospital.
And Johnny, you're a writer, and tell us more about that and also about the podcast.
So Jackson and I started Hi Everybody, Bad Medicine podcast because we needed a way to get him into Comic-Con in 2019. So we pitched it as a panel. Since then, we've done about 70 episodes. We did Comic-Con, all this at home and special editions and things like that. We did WonderCon this year as well. I've been podcasting since 2014. I did Got Thrones, a Game of Thrones podcast back when that was on the air, and the Disco Trek, which is a Star Trek Discovery podcast.
Cool.
I think I came across the podcast, probably the Comic-Con at home. I watched a lot of content, and that's when I came across the podcast. And I've been in every panel, I think, that you've done ever since, because I just love it.
Which is very appreciated. It's a fun podcast, and it's a really fun panel to do, too. I think this year's Comic-Con probably was our favorite to do. I think Johnny would agree with it, too.
Yeah, I love that we have so many medical professionals that come out, because we just show clips of this panel. Melissa, you were there, was MacGyver medicine. So it was clips of various folks, doctors, and not trying their best to make everything work. And it was like going to a stand-up show as far as the laughter we heard from the crowd. It was great.
Improvised medicine, but without the improv on our end, I think is the best way to describe it.
So how did Star Wars influence your career paths at all?
I mean, it's cool to see all the science, and then it's a good way to connect with people, and it's a fun way to explain very complicated subjects in a very simple way, or something that a common ground that people can understand, especially now with like Star Wars being much more of an overreaching kind of pulp culture phenomenon kind of thing, where it's much more easily accessible, much easier to watch everywhere now. It's easy to explain complex medical things in that kind of way too. Like, hey, you're bleeding. We're going to use this thing to stop the bleeding, kind of like the lightsaber will stop your bleeding. But it's like an electrical tool. And I think explaining complex things in terms that people can understand really helps a lot. And I think that's what brings more patient like knowledge and satisfaction and all that stuff too.
Well, let's just dive into it. Lightsabers and bleeding. What's going on there?
Well, all of those hands that get cut off. I don't know what it is with the Skywalker's saga, but it seems like everyone gets their hand cut off at some point. And it's always this perfectly clean cut, and they're able to go ahead and put a robotic hand on there. Can lightsabers cauterize the wound? Is it actually a good thing in terms of healing, or how does that work?
We have a tool in the OR called like a bovie, which is essentially an electric knife. And when it heats up pretty warm, you actually have to ground it on the patient too, so you can make a whole circuit. And then you can actually dissect tissue with it, and it will stop bleeding as they go along. Or if you make a cut, you would see some blood vessels spurting out. So you kind of tap it on there to stop the bleeding. The problem is it's a pretty irreversible kind of stop, right? You basically burn the edge of it so it doesn't bleed anymore. So you made a blind pouch. And the only way to get it back is by cutting it open, then reattaching. So usually with smaller surgeries, you try not to do that if you're trying to connect microvessels and all of that together. It's never really a clean cut. It smells horrible. I think that's the one thing they never really describe in Star Wars is the smell of burning flesh. It's not like a cookout. It is. I'm trying to think how to describe it, but it's not fun. And the fact that you can smell it through your mask makes it worse.
Oh.
Yeah.
So Anakin on Mustafar did not smell good at all.
Oh God, no. Well, then there's sulfur too, right? Because there's a whole bunch of it together. So it's gonna not smell good, and probably he has like white stench on him too.
So you mentioned that when it cauterizes, it creates a little blood pouch. Is that itself a bad thing?
No, I mean, it's hot enough that it should technically prevent any kind of infection, but also you're doing this all in a sterile field. So in theory, you shouldn't have the risk of having an infection is much lower, but you're just kind of having burnt tissue right there. So if you want to resalvage it, you have to like cut with something non-electric. It's kind of like using a hot knife cutting through butter over and over again. I remembered using it once as a medical student and I'm like, I don't want to use this anymore.
That doesn't come up super often then, it sounds like, in your line of work.
Yeah. The other thing we'll use is silver nitrate to cauterize wounds, which is a Q-tip covered in a chemical. When it gets wet, it starts burning. So if you have a really bad nosebleed for a while, we'll actually put that inside of your nose and root around. And that bubbles up and makes a weird burning sound too. Yeah.
Ow.
It's very rare, but I've used it once or twice.
It tastes like burning.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
I'm waiting for the day a kid tells me this so I can tell him that his parents raised him correctly.
Because, in the ER, they're like, I got to make Simpsons references.
They recognize I wear a lanyard filled with Simpsons pins. Some parents will point it out constantly. So it helps a lot.
This isn't a video podcast, but behind Jackson's head, there is a animation sketch of Dr. Nick.
Nice.
A proper role model for all medical professionals.
I mean, he is the patron saint of our podcast.
Well, yeah. And so we talked about prosthetics in our episode 10 of Star Warsologies. So we don't necessarily need to get into all of that. But that's interesting to know that there is sort of a mini lightsaber. I think I've seen, YouTubers make quote unquote a real lightsaber that burns at like 4,000 degrees or something like that. I'm assuming one of those would mess you up a lot differently than what lightsabers are shown in Star Wars.
I think there's blunt trauma and there's burn trauma at the same time. There's an ER version of, we call it an electrocautery as well, where it's, if you have a bleeding nail, like, when you bump your foot into the door or you jam your finger and then you develop a bunch of blood underneath your nail. It's like the most painful thing in the world. Mm-hmm. We have a tool that heats up super, super, super hot. And then we just tap your nail with it. And all the blood that's underneath just sprays out like a fountain. And there's just instant pain relief. Johnny's like, oh my God.
Yeah.
The reason I know this is true is because my dad and my grandfather, if you ever did that, would like heat up a nail.
Yeah.
And like do that at home. Like we don't need to go to the ER. We can do this at home.
But this is the classy version of it where it's in like the sterile packaging. Like I don't remember I know it's not a Simpsons podcast, but Dr. Hibbert takes out a medical 2x4 from wrapping. That's essentially what it looks like. You open up like this, all this sterile packaging, and it comes out this little pen. Take off the cap and you just press a button and it heats up super hot. And you can see everyone's face. Their eyes just get super, super big. It lights up and glows in the dark. And then you just tap the nail and then all this blood sprays out. And then I give it to the families to take home so they can use it like to start campfires and whatnot, because it's a really good campfire starter.
Wow. All right. Going back to the cauterization, because that's just creepy. When Obi-Wan slices off Ponda Baba's arm in the cantina in A New Hope, you see blood. So what do you think is different about Ponda Baba's physiology?
Not a clean cut. That was the first thing I thought. I mean, it looks like he cut it clean, but maybe it wasn't just like a clean slice. It was like a hook kind of thing. Or he just has very, very high blood pressure.
Obi-Wan was maybe out of practice. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, if he had really high blood pressure, it could spray quite a bit. So that's always a concern. I mean, he was stressed out, cut the right vessel, and then that clot that formed there didn't really form super well. So spray.
Poor guy.
Excellent. I love it.
I say everything so nonchalantly because I see so much ridiculous stuff.
For you, Johnny, when you're hosting the podcast and learning all of these things, keeping a straight face or not being super grossed out by it, how do you manage that?
Yeah, carefully. There'll definitely be times where Jackson will call me out for absolutely getting squicked out. For example, when we were talking about pinworms and I was
Oh
just
yeah.
sinking down into my chair, getting more and more uncomfortable the more in depth they went.
That was like
Yeah.
one of my favorite episodes of like just gross you out too. Because pinworms are gross. There's like a thing we always say, like, there's one thing that'll get you, be it blood, the sounds of bone drilling, certain bones popping in, eyeballs. Everyone has like a thing. And eventually you'll get face to face with it, and everyone gets really squeamish by it.
Well, onto the bacta tank, because it's definitely shown in Star Wars as sort of this like fix all, drop Luke in there after he gets attacked by the Wampa. If you haven't watched Book of Boba Fett yet, but they do use it in that, although it's like a horizontal version instead of a vertical version. I don't know what that was about.
In the Last Jedi, Finn is wearing a portable bacta suit that he gets up and walks out on, and it's just dripping everywhere. Which that stuff's got to be not cheap. So really, he should have stayed put. What can it do? What can't it do?
Seems too magical. It's funny when you mention that, because then I think of Starship Troopers too, where Johnny Rico's in a tank and getting repaired at the same time. But also Dragon Ball Z also has a tank of magic fluid that heals you. In medicine right now, there's no magic fluid that heals like that, but we do have some like equivalents of tanks. Like there's the hyperbaric oxygen chambers that we sometimes use for patients for wound healing, but also for carbon monoxide poisoning. So we'll actually put them in a tank and then change the atmospheric pressure to help them blow off the carbon monoxide, or actually can help heal wounds too. So when you mentioned
how does it do that?
I'm not a hyperbaric doctor. Well, actually, some of my old trainees in emergency medicine became hyperbaric doctors or dive doctors. I know the hyperbaric chamber, at least in terms of carbon monoxide binds with your hemoglobin more competitively than oxygen. So you need to have more oxygen so it can compete with binding spaces. So eventually the carbon monoxide will dissociate from your hemoglobin so that you can get better. That's actually why you die, is you have molecules that are supposed to help you hurt you. So you're not getting oxygen where delivered to where it is, because you have a moocher stuck onto your hemoglobin, and that's the carbon monoxide. In terms of wound healing, I'm trying to like remember all this stuff on this part. There we go. So oxygen is needed for wounds to heal properly. So I guess it's kind of like the same concept. You're just having more oxygen available to give time for these really bad wounds to heal. It's really expensive, like you would think, and it's time consuming as well. So those things together make it not feasible a lot of the times. A lot of times you're using other adjuncts like a wound vac or constant dressing changes, making sure you have proper antibiotics and not letting the wound get all soppy and wet, which is an enemy of wounds. So you're trying to keep it dry but alive at the same time.
So maybe it's just some sort of expediting that process that isn't cost inhibitive in the Star Wars galaxy, where it's just keeping things clean and encouraging the wound healing cycle.
Let the body do its job, basically.
And that was kind of my headcanon in part was, okay, this is an environment that we can keep 100% sterile because they're soaking in a liquid that is just circulating among itself and can be filtered and things like that in a way that air cannot. Is just kind of like part of my non-expert headcanon as to how part of it might work.
I always thought it's like Neosporin, but super amped up.
Well, and I'm curious because they show Darth Vader using it on an ongoing basis, correct? So it could also have some sort of, because obviously we know he's burned, he's probably got chronic pain conditions. So maybe it can even be like tweaked where like that's, pain medication.
Jelly. It's eventually swimming in Lido jelly.
Right.
It's funny when you mentioned the burn and the Neosporin, because that's actually one of the first line treatments for burns for us. Is you're supposed to dress all the burns with like some kind of antibacterial ointment, because your skin's a barrier to all infections. So whenever you violate that, you're at high risk for infections and losing moisture. So if you apply something thick and antibacterial like Neosporin or bacitracin, that's actually one of the first line treatments we use. And sometimes, because it hurts a lot, you can mix it in lidocaine jelly, but you can only use it temporarily because you don't want to use it too much because it actually seep into your blood and act on your heart, which is frowned upon. Yeah, when you mentioned that part, that reminded me of how we treat burns. It's a lot of antibiotic ointments and pain control at times.
Right. Yeah. So I can see that having to be an ongoing thing for Darth Vader.
Yeah. Don't apply toothpaste to your burns. I know I'm not giving medical advice, but that actually happened recently. Like people look it up, like, how do I treat my burns? toothpaste, I've had mustard, I've had mayonnaise, all applied to burns because they want to keep it cool.
Okay.
Wait, can you add like some, relish or other things too? I mean, it
if you're
sounds like they're
go to In-N-Out and get some spread. That'll work.
Yeah.
That'll all work together well.
Don't waste the spread. Yeah, I guess we should have said on your podcast, this does not count as medical advice. This is fun conversation amongst a bunch of nerds with specialized expertise.
Exactly.
Do you think bacta could have like stem cell therapy or something like that to help rebuild and regrow?
Stem cells are basically just undifferentiated cells. So it depends, because if you're applying it to dead cells and you're putting stem cells next to said dead cells, there's nothing for it to get stimulated by to trigger itself to grow into whatever it needs to grow into. So that sounds a little tougher.
So you got to open up the wounds again to apply some stem cells and
to make it work again.
Interesting.
That sounds painful.
Yes.
Well, James alluded to it a bit about Finn having the bag tied around him instead of being in a bacta tank. I'm trying to remember exactly what that was when Kylo Ren knocked him out, I think.
Yeah, sliced him in the back.
Yeah, right. Sliced him in the back with a lightsaber or whatever, knocked him out in episode 7. And then so in episode 8, he like wakes up. But so I'm curious about that. It was like maybe they just, because it was the Rebel base, they didn't have a bacta tank. So this is a smaller, more portable version or something like that.
Don't they have tubs?
You would think. We don't know how they shower.
Yeah.
Episode 8 opens with Finn in a bathtub filled with ice.
Where's my kidney?
Really? I mean, I think walking around with a bag doesn't work as well as probably just lying down in a tub of whatever. But I don't know. Maybe they were just trying to ration out the bacta.
Yeah, maybe.
It's not cheap. Well, you mentioned getting infections. Certainly, there's lots of ways to get infections in this world, and you get bit by dogs or sharks or whatnot. You can get infected. What do you think it's like getting digested by a sarlacc? Do you get infected, or do you get weird things happening?
Most of your immune system in a human is around your digestive system. So that's where you have most of your bacteria and whatnot. So you're trying to like keep all of that under control. So I would assume you're at higher risk for infection, but you're probably going to be digested. I'm assuming if sarlacc's biology is similar to some kind of organism on Earth, you would have a lot of acid. So you'd be pre-digested first. Then you would go through all of the menagerie of bugs and germs to help facilitate more digestion. Because your gut actually has bacteria that will digest some of your food too. And that's the ones that you don't want to digest sometimes. Like people who are lactose intolerant, they don't have lactase, which breaks down lactose. So the bacteria eat it, and then you get really gassy, and then it traps more water, and that's how you get problems. But bacteria need food too. So you have a lot of stuff in your gut, which reminds me of an episode that Johnny and I did about stool transplants.
Fecal transplants are a legit thing with a medical basis, correct, Jackson?
Yes. And we either do it with a tube through your nose or have you swallow freeze-dried pills of bacteria. And the reason why you do it is to fight infection, like mainly C. diff. So kind of going back to the whole sarlacc thing, which is like a big roundabout loop, there's a lot of bacteria in there, some good, some bad. And the really bad ones, if it's all germ warfare, can potentially get you really, really sick. And I'm assuming the sarlacc feasting on like a healthy diet of rebels and whatnot, probably okay. His gut's probably fine. It's just all the people being fed to him are being exposed to bacteria that are not fine.
Well, if I remember correctly, on your podcast, I think it was episode 5, you covered some Star Wars. That was more to do with like Padme dying of a broken heart and things like that. Is that right? Yeah.
And it's there's actually something called broken heart syndrome. It's called Takotsubo disease. And it's basically in English means octopus trap. And your heart kind of is weirdly shaped. So any kind of horrible stress to your person can cause you to have some kind of heart attack or arrhythmia and then die. So we were talking whether or not this would work with Padme, and it potentially can be if she has that kind of heart condition. And you would assume the other people would have that heart condition too. By the other people, I mean her children.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, well, you definitely see Leia tough it out through a lot of things, but Luke does seem like a fragile boy sometimes. So that's interesting.
The softie. I'm trying to remember what else we talked about in that episode. Johnny, do you remember?
Yeah, we talked about that. We talked about the Mustafar fight, specifically the burn wounds and things like that. And did a little bit of talking about the fact that, like, oh, all of a sudden, Darth Vader is significantly taller than what we saw remaining of Anakin.
Oh, interesting. So when they gave him new legs, they like added a couple inches or something.
He couldn't be a short king anymore. They had to make him very, very tall. Because he looked like average height, and then he was what, 7 something?
Maybe not that tall, but
yeah,
definitely
much taller,
lording over people.
Yes.
So I could see that that's part of the outfit, you know, just like the Kiss boots or whatever, you know, the platforms.
It would have been weird though, because then he would have long legs but short arms.
Well, you know, he's got all prosthetic arms too, so they could have just lengthened those. That he'd have short upper arms but longer forearms
and tiny torso.
Look at me, I'm a little T-Rex.
I mean, I think some of it's also in the costume too, though,
Yes.
right? Like it's intimidating. You put a cape there, you put all sorts of flashing buttons on your chest.
Half of his torso is his life support.
Right, exactly. So it doesn't look. I'm gonna have to look for that though now. Even though I know it's just because they're different actors.
Yeah, but for me, I'm like, why? How did he get so much taller? It's stretched out. I know he probably has longer prosthetics, but it wasn't all of his limbs weren't chopped off, if I remember correctly, right?
No,
I think
and
that
he lost
part's up.
one limb to Dooku, and then when he gets all sliced up by Obi-Wan, the one limb he still has is his prosthetic arm from Dooku. So he's lost all his limbs.
The other thing I'm curious about, Leia's exposure to the vacuum of space. We just talked about the sensitivity of the human body and those sorts of things. What actually happens when you are submitted to the vacuum of space?
I would assume suffocation first, because there's no oxygen. It's all the atoms or whatnot are spread far apart, and that's why you have the vacuum of space, right? Because everything's trying to fill up whatever. So I think you mentioned it, and I think there was a panel about it at Comic-Con where it said it's not instantaneous death, which is true. It's a very painful, horrible death. Anything that can expand will expand. So your lungs will probably expand bigger than it should be. Blood vessels will expand. Bubbles of air in your blood vessels that are existing already will expand. So that'll happen. Your eyeballs will expand. So basically, think of it like a marshmallow in a vacuum. That's essentially what happens to your body.
I'm now going to go get some marshmallows and vacuum them up.
Oh, you never did the marshmallow in a bell jar thing in like grade school?
No.
Oh, we'll send over a video.
We'll include that in the show notes then. And that's probably why they just show, you know, your eyes freezing up and your body sort of freezing a little bit, is that showing everything expanding is a bit more graphic.
Yeah. Or like For All Mankind did it in what probably looked to be a more realistic way, where, you know, as they were exposed for a longer time, they just started bleeding like everywhere.
Yeah. And those are probably the vessels that are all popping. So that's when you start just bleeding. You have a lot of gas in your stomach in general, you'll get bloated. But like, you never really see it because, I mean, in pop culture, most of the time, no one's like going out full on exposed. It's like usually they're in a suit of some sort, I guess, except for Guardians of the Galaxy 2. What's his face was out there and then he died, but he just froze gently. But well, it's not that gentle as what I would assume if you're in a vacuum.
You're more like a piece of popcorn and you just hit the oil and just everything goes foop.
More or less, I would assume, but not that fast.
When I was going back and watching Star Wars with a more, not critical eye, but a more scientific eye, was when they walk out inside of the space slug. You know, are they in space? Does the asteroid have some sort of atmosphere or whatever? Because they wear like masks or whatever to breathe out of. But that's not actually enough if they were out in the vacuum of space. No. So maybe there's some sort of atmosphere.
Yeah. And then you got to protect those ears too, because your ears will probably pop. Like even when you just go up a little bit of an altitude, you can already feel the pressure in your ears building. Now multiply that by infinity. Right. That's a good way to kind of think of the discomfort you would feel.
Do you have any other questions you want to ask, James?
Just the most random thing from the Obi-Wan series. You see him, he works in a desert fish butchery and he's handling raw fish, and he clearly there's no water for him to wash his hands. What do you think he's carrying, you know, microbe wise when he goes home from work?
We're gonna start talking about pinworms again, Johnny. Earmuffs.
I mean, the biggest thing that we tell people to look out for when they eat raw seafood is Vibrio cholera, which causes you to get cholera. So a lot of watery diarrhea and whatnot. So that can make you really, really sick just in the stomach bugs. Again,
and on Tatooine, that's really bad. You're losing all your water.
Yeah. You can't afford to lose any, like you're swallowing more organisms and now you're upsetting the delicate balance in your gut again. So we're kind of going back to like gut bacteria. So that's known to cause a lot of like illnesses in general. So that's probably a bad thing on that part. Parasites in fish, I mean, amoebas are probably the biggest concern, but usually that's just from fresh water. And those are where you get your brain-eating amoebas that were really popular in the news, I think like 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah, going to New Zealand and like relaxing in a nice hot lake or whatever. And it's like, don't put your nose below the water.
Yeah.
Like, I'm trying to relax here in this, hot springs. And it's like, there's little cartoon versions of brain eating amoebas. If you put your head in the water, it's like, okay.
I don't want my brain being eaten out. I had one patient of that in residency. It was from fresh water as well.
And here's where I question the premise of the question. Maybe Johnny can answer this. Is a crate dragon considered fish?
I don't think it was a crate dragon.
You don't think it was a crate dragon? They were.
Yeah, it almost certainly wasn't fish. I would think a crate dragon, if anything, would be like insectoid crustacean, maybe. Would
Lobster.
Be the closest analog. Yeah.
Interesting. I really thought it was a crate dragon because it was like, to me, it looked like this sort of pop-up situation where they killed something and then all of a sudden this like economy popped up around it. So I'll have to go back and watch now again.
I thought it was some other large, megafauna that, died near the surface, and, it's like a big land shark or big sandfish or something. And they're just like, hey, we can, mine this for sushi.
Yeah. I mean, certainly what they showed looked like a big chunk of sushi, like the salmon or whatever that you get on sushi. So I just had to point out that, because I know that there's some animals that are more fishy because they're water creatures, and we don't need to get into that, but it's like alligator is fishy, but ostriches are red meat, and it just kind of depends on the environment you live in, sort of thing. So anyway, not
Is
important.
it bad that I want sushi after this conversation?
I don't think so. We all live in coastal California. I think it's probably safe. At least you're not. When I used to volunteer at the aquarium, people on their way out would ask where the nearest sushi restaurant was. And I was like, y'all, this is like an educational facility, not a menu. It was so weird. But everyone asked where they could go get seafood or sushi on, oh, do you have a recommendation? I would just be like,
Don't they sell fish tacos right outside at the little cafe at the aquarium?
Oh God, I hope not.
Here's a weird tangent though. Like I remembered after anatomy class in med school, we all were really hungry, and that was the worst feeling ever. No joke. Like, oh, we just had 2 hours of anatomy lab. Why are we so hungry? We had lunch just before this, and everyone, like without fail, would be like, let's just go get some food. Yes.
Yeah, that I could see that being pretty disconcerting.
Oh yeah, all of us felt real bad that we were so hungry after anatomy class. It was horrible, but good food.
If you didn't think about it too much.
Yeah.
So you mentioned earlier about having to reattach a missing limb due to a shark.
Yeah. So we live in San Diego, and it's always like a fear of people like, hey, you're going to get bitten by a shark. And it's a very, very rare thing. But in popular media, it sounds like it happens all the time. But this was like a surfer that was out and about swimming, and then just got his arm chopped off from the shoulder. I was still kind of like dangling, but then fell off. And then you'll get stories. When the patient came in, it's like a lot of controlling the bleeding. So you're putting pressure on the area. You're not cauterizing anything yet. Unlike what we were talking about earlier with lightsabers, you really just want to apply some gauze, some pressure just to keep that tissue viable. But then like paramedics will come in and just go, here's some of his personal belongings. And you're like, oh, cool. It's probably like his bag, his backpack, whatever. And they plop an arm right into your chest. And you're like, okay. And then you hand it off gently and you tell someone, please not to lose it. And that's not the first time I've ever had a limb tossed into myself. So
well, you got to hand it to you.
How dare you? I was disarmed by that comment. I'm
mostly armless.
I can't think of another one. But this other patient was driving his car and arms out the window, just enjoying the nice time. And then his car rolled over, arms get pinched, and then his arm also got removed from his body. And the same thing, except this time it was wrapped in nice plastic wrap and then given to me. But I'll get times where families bring in fingers that get lopped off and they come to my hospital. I'm like, no, let me send you to somewhere who can do surgeries. And this, I'll never forget, this finger came in. Key point, do not put it directly on ice. Do not put any limbs directly on ice. You want to wrap it and put it on top of the ice or in something cool, because the ice can actually form crystals and then that will damage tissue further. But this finger came in with the full tendon attached to the lower part of the arm too. So that it was just like a dangly noodle attached to a finger. And they're like, we kept it on ice. I took it immediately out of the ice, wrapped it in some wet gauze, put it in a plastic bag, and then put it on like an ice bath. And then told them we need to send you to another hospital to reattach it.
Did any of these things you have like the result?
All the arms were salvaged. So they all reattached and were fine. I always joke like time is brain and whatnot. Time is arm in the situation. So the sooner you can attach it, the less damage is happening on a cellular structure that would cause rejection or infection later on.
So if you lose an arm and you're going to the hospital, don't do the Uber pool. Get the direct route.
Yeah. Get the priority one if you can.
Right.
If you want to be nice, get an XL.
Make sure it's your arm that you don't use to unlock your phone and type stuff in.
Exactly. Also sit on the side with your arm that works so that you can open the door properly. Because it's really awkward to reach over and try to open the door.
Is a really smart tip that most people don't think of when they lose a limb.
Not medical advice, but I think it's practical in this situation. Yeah.
Well, so we were talking earlier about the guy in the cantina whose name I can't remember.
Honda Baba
gets his arm cut off. So do you think, I'm trying to remember, do they show him? Is he dead? Do they, could that arm be reattached based on what you
lived.
saw? Okay.
He lived?
Yeah.
He just dropped to the ground.
The arm dropped to the ground.
I mean, yes, that too. So
I just can't remember seeing him after that. Like, did he just grab the arm and like hobble out of there? Like, no big deal. If he didn't put it on ice and got to a bacta tank quickly, oh my God, James is showing us a figure where the action figure where the arm actually comes off.
Oh my God, that's fantastic.
But yeah, I mean, so if he got to someplace quick enough in Mos Eisley, you think that arm could be reattached?
Yeah, I think so. If they dropped in some bacta, it probably would be fine. Yeah. And then here begs the question, if you cut him at the arm and you put him in bacta, and bacta is really good at healing, do you get two of them?
Hey, bonus arm.
Yeah.
I don't feel like we ever see anything like regeneration, right? Everything's always robotic.
And that's one of the things with Star Wars is that, it was a product of the 70s and 80s where we didn't really think about regeneration so much. We're like, oh, prosthetics. And, as we moved into the future where we're like, oh yeah, we can do things to regrow organs. We seem to be headed in that direction, or get transplants. Do you think the clones, like one of them gets injured in the battlefield, there's like, we're going to use this other dead clone for parts?
Should. I mean, they technically share the same DNA, right? So if that's the case, then the likelihood of rejection should be a lot lower because it's essentially from the same person.
Yeah, that makes sense. Transplant donors and things like that. You don't have to do the blood tests and all those sorts of things.
Yeah, it's the same thing. It's the same person. So you essentially have a clone army and then a clone army of organ donors. It's an organ farm.
Dark, but it makes sense. Well, and I was thinking when you were talking about regrowing things, like the Deadpool situation or whatever, oddly enough, what comes to mind when I think of, regrowing limbs. There's so many different looking aliens in Star Wars that, in lizards here on Earth, they can drop their tails and regrow a new one. Does Frog Lady, if she lost her tail, would she regrow it? Do the ones that look sort of like dinosaurs, if they lost their arm, would they not even pick it up? They're like, just give me a week.
I think in the comics, I remember a Trandoshan that had gotten its arms ripped off by Chewbacca. Later on, you see him in a bar and he's got little stubby arms starting to grow again.
There you go.
The nubbins.
Is that the ones that look kind of like dinosaurs?
Yeah. Like
okay.
Bosk,
right. Yeah. Okay. Well, our last question is one that we ask all of our guests, and that is, who is your favorite character in Star Wars? And we are judging you based on your answers. Just FYI.
That's fine.
I would probably go Han Solo.
I mean, that was going to be my answer too.
It can be everybody's favorite. That's fine.
He's so cool. I mean, he's not Lando cool, but he's still pretty cool. Mm-hmm. But Lando was a traitor for a second. Made me not like him for a little bit. But I would pick Han.
the important question that we ask at the end, how do people get into the field of medicine? I mean, people know about medical school, but what do you need to do to be on that track?
I took a very roundabout way. Like I got my master's degree. I always wanted to do emergency medicine of some sort, but I remembered when I first worked with my first adult patient in emergency medicine came in saying he was in 10 out of 10 pain and he wanted pain medication. And I said, how did you get here? And he said, I walked here. And I said, and of course, in my smart ass med student voice, I'm like, so you're not in 10 out of 10 pain then if you walked here? He goes, am I going to have to beat you up to get my medicine? I'm like, no, you're just not going to get any medicine because I'm a medical student and I can't write it for you. But now I'm going to tell my boss not to give it to you. And I'm like, I don't want to work with adults. So I ended up doing pediatrics and then I ended up in pediatric emergency medicine. So there was like 3 years of residency and then 3 years of fellowship. And now I'm an attending. So it took forever to get to where I am at. It's fun though. Like job satisfaction for pediatric emergency medicine used to be one of the highest because our patients don't usually get stupid sick. But when you actually get to like make a big impact, it's really fun. And for someone with a short attention span, it's fantastic because I never sit still at my job.
And what about you, Johnny? If someone wants to be a writer and podcaster, what do you recommend?
Expose yourself to everything. Let me rephrase that. Listen to and read everything you can get your hands on.
Yeah, there you go. I like it. That's definitely much more my speed. All right. Well, tell us a little bit more about how we can find your podcast, where you are on social media, anything else you have coming up.
So the podcast is Hi Everybody Bad Medicine Podcast. You can find us at Hi Everybody MD on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and eventually TikTok someday, and www.hieverybodymd.com.
Do you have any other planned conventions or anything like that? Or are you mostly just doing the Southern California?
Right now, we're just doing Southern California. We'd love to do more. Just need to figure out a way to work that into the real life schedules.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Jackson and Johnny, both for being here. I really liked talking more Star Wars with you. I'm sure you'll talk about it even more on your show, but it sounds like you've got a huge list of things to do. So I'm glad we got you on here to talk about Star Wars.
Yeah, we can't wait to have you guys on.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
It was a great time.
Yeah, great.
Well, that wraps up this episode of Star Warsologies. We'd like to thank our guests, Dr. Jackson Vane and Johnny Kolasinski, and we want to thank all of you for listening, especially at ArtistQF and Ryan Bullock. If you have an idea for a topic for Star Warsologies or know an expert we should interview, let us know at Star Warsologies on Twitter and Instagram, or at Star Warsologies, that's StarWarsologies @gmail.com. Please also rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast on your favorite service. No topic is off limits, even reattaching shark-bitten wounds and pinworms.
That's right. We are part of the Skywalking Network, where you can also find a variety of other great shows about Star Wars, Disney, and Marvel, like Talking Apes, the Mac FX podcast, Resilience Squadron, and the flagship show Skywalking Through Neverland. And they also have a YouTube show, Today in Star Wars History. You can find all of that at skywalkingnetwork.com. We'll see you next time on Star Warsologies when we discuss holograms in Star Wars after a super cool San Diego Comic-Con panel that we went to. See you then.